Hi, my name is Patrick Sutczak. I'm the director of Sawtooth ARI in Launceston, also an artist. Today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about my practice and how I work with place and spaces, but particularly I like to look at one aspect of my practice, which is mapping. So today I want to talk a little bit about cartography and the ideas of what maps are, what they can be, and how they've taken hold in creative practice. Traditionally, when we think about a map, we think about its utilitarian function as a document, something that gives us information in some ways to get us from A to B. Historically, maps were designed for that very purpose, to help people navigate the world around them. And that's primarily what they do, is help us to make sense of the world. If we think about examples of maps, some pretty simple ones come to mind. We can think of a road map, how to navigate a city. We can think about topographical maps that give a certain amount of information about geography. So if you think about a topographical map, you can look at the image on the page and it will give you a certain amount of information to help you navigate that space before you even enter it. Maps can be more than lines on a page. When we start to think about road maps tucked away in the dashboard of a car, we think of them as these complex documents that we need to be able to read and understand at first glance. But I think maps can be a lot more than that. They have a greater purpose in making up the history of the world and the people that inhabit it as well. A map can have many, many elements to it. It can be more than just a visual representation of place. It can be the overlay of experience. So therefore a map might not make any visual reference to the place at all. It might just be based on elements that are there, how animals move through the space, how humans move through this space, the kind of traces that are left. That might make its way into a map as well. So on some level it gives you some information. In many ways maps are the marrying of imagination with experience. For someone to go to a place, for instance a geographical place, a location, they need to start to sort of see what's there and how they can present that in a visual form. This is where in creative practice, or in my own creative practice, the map is a really important part of it. Because I like to work with representation of place, I first need to understand what that place is about, what is there, all different types of elements that can make its way into a visual document to represent that place. Maps are actually quite abstract and they tend to tell us a lot about the map maker as well as the place itself. And this is where we think about the types of information that makes its way onto the page. If we think about a Google map these days, we can look at satellite imagery, we can get a lot of top-down information about what is in that area. There's also scope now to actually remove information so that we break it down to streets, or we break it down to restaurants, or we break it down to topographical information, height above sea level, hills and roads and all the rest of it. And so this is something that we can think about when we start to create maps and start to make them. Essentially, we're all map makers. We're all trying to make sense of the world around us, and we do this by taking photographs, writing information down. For me, I tend to look at maps as being quite abstract in my practice because I know that they can be anything. They can be sculpture, maps can be words. Essentially, maps are just information being conveyed to a reader, to an audience. In creating a map, which everyone can do, I think it's important to start subjectively, to start to look at things that are important to you as the map maker. You don't necessarily have to have experience in cartography and surveying to be able to make a map. You simply have to be able to convey information, and this is where I find the beauty in maps, because they can do that in lots and lots of different ways. Essentially, you would go to a place. For me, I like to work out in natural areas, out in agricultural properties, urban areas as well. So I do that by looking at things like boundaries. So for instance, we might look at fences. So you start to locate where I am in relation to other things around a site. And then once you start to overlay this information, you start to get a bigger sense of place. As I said, when I make my own maps in my own practice, I tend to think of them as being quite abstract, in the sense that I do leave a lot of information out. So for me, a map can be a poem, it can be a text, it can be a series of observations. But there's always scope to move into that visual realm and build up what we're seeing visually, how we're navigating the world around us visually. So if you start to make your own map, you might start with something like a photograph. It could be a place that's important to you. As maps are quite subjective, it will be about your experience of the place. So you might start making notes from memory or from observations. And then you might start to kind of overlay those over the image itself. Then you might start to think about how to abstract the information, how to make it more subjective from your own experience, because really a map is, you're giving something to someone else. You're really showing them a sense of place from your perspective. And that's what maps have done historically. In my practice, I use a lot of GPS data to track where I've been. I'm not so much interested in where I'm going. I don't use that information to kind of return to it. I just like to see where I've been. In particular, ideas of frequency of a particular place. When I map an area, I spend a lot of time there. I go there frequently. And so I want to try and track those lines and see how I move through the space and start to see elements like desire lines, for instance. Why I keep moving through the space in a certain way. For me, that's information that's valuable. I then turn that into a visual map, a sound piece, a sculpture. There's lots of different ways of doing it. I've got two examples of maps which I've created here. One has some factual information on it, and one has factual information that is mixed up with fictional information to create a whole new map that exists in a very different space. The first example I've got here is a map from a cemetery in Paris. When I was there, I looked at first, when I got there, I had never been there before. The first thing I did was find a map, which pretty much has the big red dot on it that says, "You are here." From that, I'm able to locate myself in relation to other things in the cemetery. So what I started doing was capturing these images, photographing these maps. What I wanted to do was try and create a new map based on experience of traversing that area. Maps like that generally tell you how to get to a place. They're a guide. If you want to get from A to B successfully, you'll follow the map. It was very important for me to create this map that I didn't do that. I wanted to make my own map, my own experience of that place. So what I've done is I've actually stripped back information, I've retained some of it, and then I've overlaid maps together. This creates an abstract map which is based closer to my experience. A second example of a map I have here is using GPS data. With this one, I've recorded my movements. To create this particular map, I walked over 700 kilometres over a 4-month period. What I did was record my walks every day. Again, I overlaid all that information. So what this map tells me is how frequently I moved through the space. I've also got other information to create this map on how long it took me to get from A to B, how I kept returning to the same places. What started off as a single line soon became a cluster of information that I can look at, and straight away I can read it. One question we could ask is, why do we make maps? And essentially I think the answer to that question is to make sense of the world, to locate ourselves in history and time and place, and leave that as a guide for other people to use.